So these are some graphics from this study. So you can see the blue line is the percentage of genetically engineered soy and corn crops grown in the United States. And the red line is how much glyphosate was applied to corn and soy. So you can see how much it's gone up since like 1990. Like if you see from like 2000, it's more than doubled now. And then the yellow bars is the incidence of diabetes diagnosis. So if you start at about 2000, or like this one, 1996, 3.5% were diagnosed with diabetes. And now we're up to almost 6.5%. And there's a pretty good correlation. You can see up there it says R equals 0.971. Basically a 97% correlation between glyphosate use and the incidence of diabetes. So they studied this for a whole bunch of other conditions. This is the obesity rate. It basically looks the same. This is the line it would have increased that was to be expected. So it seems to, at this point where they started using glyphosate, it seems to just gone up exponentially. Rather than increase steadily in a linear form, as it did before, it just went right up. And so this is deaths due to hypertension. It's same story. And then this is inflammatory bowel disease and Crohn's disease, like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. It's also gone up exponentially. And this is very interesting. This is the incidence of autism and correlated with glyphosate applied to corn and soy, and it's an almost perfect correlation. You can see R equals 0.9893, almost a 99% correlation. That's like basically 100%. That's crazy. And of course, correlation doesn't mean causation, like every scientist should know. But you would think that if you get such a strong correlation and somebody would say, hey, wait a minute, we need to do some studies to see if there is a causal effect. But none of this has been done, and it won't get done, because we don't want to find that effect. So this is the same thing for Alzheimer's. Yeah, it speaks for itself. This is bladder cancer. This is bile duct cancer, thyroid cancer. Okay, yeah. So you can see, you can kind of see why our healthcare premiums are rising so fast. And maybe we should ask Monsanto to pay some of them. No. What glyphosate does in proteins, and a couple of years ago, Stephanie Seneff, who's a personal hero of mine, she's at MIT in Boston, and she's a PhD. She has published a bunch of papers on glyphosate, and she's very active in trying to get this banned, and she's also researching autism. And she published something that said glyphosate is now being incorporated into proteins, because animal feed, like that's not organic, is basically GMO. So it's doused in glyphosate. There's a ton of it in it. So all these animals are eating a ton of glyphosate. But it's not actually found in the meat. Like when you test it, you don't find the glyphosate, which always kind of surprised me. But what they found now is it's getting incorporated into the proteins of the meat. So it's part of the protein now. And because glyphosate is basically an amino acid glycine with a phosphate group, glycine is a very common amino acid used to make all kinds of proteins and enzymes. So now if that gets incorporated into proteins in place of glycine, you now have a protein or enzyme, and where there's supposed to be glycine, there's glyphosate. So you now have this phosphate group sticking out that's not supposed to be there. So this can completely render enzymes dysfunctional and change the shape of a protein. So if this is a little graphic of an enzyme, and this is the substrate, so enzymes and substrates have this lock and key shape. So the enzyme is formed to fit exactly into the substrate so that it can catalyze the reaction. So like this. But if there's like glycine somewhere here and you have a phosphate group sticking into the space, into the active site, now the substrate can't bind anymore, or it can't bind properly, and the reaction won't work. So when you look at what proteins are high in glycine in our bodies that can potentially then incorporate glyphosate, there's hormone-sensitive lipase, which you need to burn fat. So if that doesn't work, you can get obesity, in theory. The insulin receptor is high in glycine, so that's a possible reason for diabetes. Then the beta-amyloid plug in Alzheimer's has glycine. And this is an enzyme that basically deals with oxidative stress, which you need to keep your DNA from being damaged. And if that doesn't work, then you have a higher cancer risk. And this adrenocorticotropic hormone, you need to make adrenal hormones. If that doesn't work, you're going to have adrenal insufficiency. This enzyme is part of your energy production chain. And if this isn't working, you're not going to make energy. You're going to get chronic fatigue, basically, mitochondrial disease. And this guy is important for has been linked to ALS. So if this isn't working, it's a potential cause for ALS. The GABA receptor is high in glycine, and that has been implicated in autism. And then collagen, which our joints have collagen, our gut wall has collagen. It's a very important protein. It's 1/3 of it is glycine. So if that gets glyphosate incorporated instead of glycine, then you're going to have more leaky gut and inflamed joints and all sorts of other stuff. So this list is not complete. You can get more if you like at this link. Okay, so where is glyphosate in our food supply? We need to know so that we can avoid it. So previously, like, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago or so, glyphosate was only used on GMO crops. And the main ones were corn, soy, canola, and safflower. So if you didn't want to eat glyphosate, it was pretty easy. You just avoid non-organic corn, soy, canola, and safflower, and a couple of things, and you were fine. Or, turns out those were the good old days. Now, farmers started using glyphosate as a desiccant on wheat and sugarcane, and I read about this a few years ago. And they do this 3 days before harvest because it kills the plant, because it's a herbicide, right? And it makes it easier to harvest because then the plant is all dry and you get the grain out better. This is now being done on basically all grains and legumes and all sorts of other things. So in the last decade or so, we've seen this explosion of gluten intolerance in people, and more people are going gluten-free. And I wonder if the reason for all this gluten intolerance, is the glyphosate. Because there's people that can go to Europe that are gluten intolerant, cannot eat gluten here, get terrible stomach upset. They go to Europe and they eat whatever baked goods they want, and they're fine. And they come back here and, oh no, can't eat gluten. It's something that we're doing to it. It's the way we're producing this. And glyphosate sprayed on wheat could be a big factor in why there's now all this gluten intolerance. And another thing that I found out recently is it's now increasingly being applied to fruit and nut trees to kill the grass at the base of the trees, so you don't have to mow it, or it seems like a not very good reason to spray glyphosate. And Monsanto's been telling farmers, oh, don't worry about it, it's not going to get in the root system, it's not going to get taken up by the plants. Not true. And it's basically applied to all grains and legumes, and also cheese.